Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hello, I'm Karen Lucas, Managing Director at the Independent Women's Forum and your host for today's Working for Women podcast. Today, I'm here with Jillian Melchior, IWF Senior Fellow. Jillian, thanks so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You recently wrote a piece about a double standard when it comes to energy policy and the impact, energy policy, and the impact that different energy sources have on public health. Can you tell me a little bit about what the environmentalist movement insists upon when they're evaluating exploration for fossil fuels, and compare that a little bit to have their attitude towards wind energy?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. So I actually hadn't realized this until I went out on a hydraulic fracking site for a visit. But the science there is just incredible. I mean, you see technicians literally every 5 minutes taking a reading, double-checking things, making sure that everything is running perfectly and in a safe way. And I mean, it's really rigorous. It's very intense to watch. But nonetheless, despite that scientific rigor, and despite a lot of studies on the public health behind hydraulic fracking, environmentalists really play up fears that it's not safe. And we particularly see that anytime you have a ballot measure or, a state or a city considering putting in place a hydraulic fracking ban. So, for instance, in Colorado, when they were doing fracking bans a couple of years ago, you saw environmentalists giving an outside voice to people who were saying that they were concerned about their drinking water. They were concerned about other risks that weren't necessarily grounded in science. Then in New York State, which banned fracking, you saw the state actually going so far to try to find a public health risk to, I guess, cave to their environmental lobby, that they actually said one of the health risks was the stress associated with boom time economics. Like, save us from that. How awful to have the health risk of a really healthy and flourishing economy. So that's one side of it. That's traditional energy. What we have seen, though, recently is with wind energy, there are health concerns. It's a pretty new technology, particularly for energy generation. And we're starting to see reports of people saying that they're getting headaches, that they're having problems with their sleeping, for instance, that they feel dizzy. And while the green energy lobby, the environmental lobby, has been very aggressive in following up with any claim of that type within traditional energy, when it comes to wind, which is their preferred energy source, they want to just shove that under the rug. They don't want discussion about it. They think that the science is settled, and a question that you're against green energy. So I think what we're really seeing here is a double standard, where traditional energy is already held to a very rigorous standard. Any complaint is put on a pedestal by the green energy industry, but when it wins, it doesn't apply.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So have there been any studies of the impact of wind energy production on the people in the surrounding areas or on people's health who are associated with it?
Well, I think one of the things that's noteworthy is when it comes to wind energy, this is something that we're just finding out about. There are a lot of anecdotal complaints about, like I mentioned, headaches, dizziness, sleeping disturbances. But, for example, the American Wind Energy Association, which is the biggest trade group representing this largely subsidized industry, has said, and I'm going to give you a direct quote, that allegations of health-related impacts are not supported by science. And then they cite a couple of different studies, saying that these studies refute claims that there are health risks. Well, I actually took a look at the studies, went through and read them, and that's not exactly what it's saying. For instance, they say we don't have a direct link that we're proving yet, but we are finding a lot of people who are complaining about dizziness, sleeping problems, headaches, some of the things that are complaining. In fact, an Australian study that even the American Wind Energy Association points to calls for more research and says that there needs to be more high-quality research on the possible health effects. So this is a thing that's definitely still developing. It's just important because there's a health risk, because this is a largely subsidized industry, that good science is done on it. And I think you really see the green left being anti-science in this case.
That's funny. It's not, this isn't, it's funny when you hear about this, because I think that those of us who've been following energy policy are kind of familiar with some of this double standards when it comes to different sources of energy. Can you tell us a little bit and tell our listeners about the impact on the environment and in particularly on birds and endangered species? That's one where I think it's kind of jaw-dropping how much the environmentalists are using a sliding scale when it comes to judging people's activities.
Yeah, I mean, you see this with traditional energy. I was just last month reporting on the coal industry in Gillette, Wyoming. And they were saying that if a single endangered bird, like a bald eagle, died on the site, that would be enough to shut down operations for a little bit. It would be a really, really big deal. So that's traditional energy. But if you look at wind energy, in May, the Obama administration actually proposed a regulation that would let wind energy companies kill or maim as many as 4,200 bald eagles. That's a ton of them, in contrast to one potentially shutting down a coal site. Now, we're not just seeing this with bald eagles. We're seeing it with bats running into wind turbines. We're seeing it in the solar industry to some extent. I remember reporting out of California on how these giant solar panels will literally like crisp fry a bird out of the air. And, we can have a conversation about the pros and cons of that, whether it's worth it or not. But that's beside the point. I think what listeners really need to know is that wind energy, solar energy, is being held to a different standard once again than traditional energy. And I'll point out, too, it comes down to subsidies as well. If you look at how much money has been poured into this, literally under the Obama administration, billions of dollars into green energy. Right now, wind only accounts for 4.7 of all of our energy generation. So you see it not only getting special treatment when it comes to regulation, a push for special treatment when it comes to scientific facts, but also a lot of money for not a lot of punch.
Yeah. So we've been down this road before. I mean, I feel like over the last decade, there's been a real evolution in the conversation about ethanol. 10, 15 years ago, ethanol was being held up as the solution if we could just use biofuels, and it was considered such a huge boon to the environmental, or to our environment potentially, to replace the fossil fuels with biofuels. Until people started pointing out, and it was really over kind of reluctant that the environmentalists began to admit this, but that you had things where they were clear-cutting rainforests, and then once you take into account all of the huge amount of resources that have to be invested in creating biofuels, all of a sudden it wasn't that much of a winner, and we really had to kind of roll back our attitude towards it. It's just funny. It seems like the environmental movement needs to remember that its core mission isn't just to destroy fossil fuels, but to protect the environment. It seems like that often gets lost in the conversation.
Yeah, I think the ethanol example is a fantastic one. It's been interesting to watch some environmentalists coming forward. There's one noteworthy environmentalist, I believe it's in Michigan or Indiana, who's been putting a ton of money actually against biofuels because it's not as green as it was billed to be. Bottom line here, though, is there's no energy that's not going to have a con. They've all got pros and cons. And it is really, really important to American families that energy is generated in a safe and responsible way. I have no problem with good research on it, on any sort of energy generation. But I think what's duplicitous and frustrating is that in this case, out of, I guess, an idealism toward renewable energy, the Green Lobby is pushing us to turn a blind eye to science that, it's not conclusive right now, but it does show some worrisome things about wind energy generation, and that merits exploration. If traditional energy is going to be held to that standard, it's really important that wind energy be held to that same rigorous standard. And anybody who tells you otherwise, that's not very scientific. That's pseudoscience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jillian. This was such a real eye-opening conversation. I really learned a lot. And for those who listen, thank you for your time. This has been another edition of IWF Working for Women podcast. You can find more about this topic and many more at IWF.org.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by IWF.org for similar content.